David, you might need to turn me up a bit. I don't know, my voice hasn't quite recovered from all the coughing yet. Thank you. Right, we are going to come back to Romans 11, but I'm just going to read something else first. In the latter days it will come to pass that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and peoples shall flow to it. And many nations shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and we may walk in his paths. For the Lord shall go forth out of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge between many peoples, and shall decide for strong nations afar off. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and neither shall there be war any more. Those verses are from Micah chapter 4, and they're almost word for word in Isaiah chapter 2 as well. So why have I read that? Well, if we go back to Romans 11, where we left off the last time I spoke, we've talked about how the church should be grafted in to its Jewish roots. And Paul goes on a bit, and then in verse 25, he says that the Gentiles should not become self-opinionated, wise in our own conceits, because the hardening of the hearts of the Jews and the blindness is only for a temporary period until the fullness of the gathering of the Gentiles is complete. So let's have a think about the Gentiles, shall we, for a bit. I read that passage from Micah because it talks about the nations coming up to Jerusalem. There's only one word in the Hebrew that's Gentiles, nations, peoples, and it's the word goyim. The single is goy, which you may have heard. Jewish people will say goys. It's not derogatory, it's just the word for anybody who isn't a Jew. And the nations are the goyim, and the Gentiles are the goyim. So when you read your Old Testament, your Hebrew scriptures, every time it mentions peoples, nations or Gentiles, it's talking about the goyim. And it comes first in Genesis chapter 10 verse 5, and it's after the flood, and it's saying what happened to the sons of Noah and their descendants. And it's the sons of Shem, Noah's son, become the Semitic races, the Jews and the Arabs. The sons of Ham and Japheth become the Goyim, the nations. And the nations go on right the way through. So in a sense, the time of the Gentiles, which Jesus talked about, which we'll come back to, starts way back in Genesis chapter 10. Whatever the date of that was, I'm afraid I don't know. Do you know? But the nations, the Gentiles, most of them were a bit of a thorn in the flesh to the Jews most of the time. They were constantly attacking and trying to get rid of them. So what's new? Not much. The nations were always there. But later on, as we go through the history of the Jews and then come to a lot of the prophets, we have a bit more about the nations. And I've got a lot of verses here, so you'll have to bear with me while I find what I'm looking for. But Isaiah, chapter 11. Where's that one? 11 verses 10 to 12. These are sometimes read at Christmas, I think, in the story, the prophecies concerning the Messiah. And it shall be in that day that the root of Jesse shall stand as a signal for the peoples. So obviously that's Jesus. Of him shall the nations inquire, and his dwelling shall be glory. And in that day the Lord will again lift up his hand a second time to recover the remnant of his people, which is left from Assyria, from Lower Egypt, from Parthias, from Ethiopia, from Elam, from Sumar, from Hamath in Upper Syria, and from the countries bordering the Mediterranean. And he will raise up a signal for the nations, the Goyim, and will assemble the outcasts of Israel, and will gather together the dispersal of Judah from the four corners of the earth. So it's a sign to the nations when the peoples of Israel, the Jews, are being gathered together and brought back to the land. And then Isaiah 49, verse 22, thus says the Lord, behold, I will lift up my hand, lifting up his hand all the time, to the Gentile nations, and I will set high my standard, and they will bring your sons in the bosom of their garments, and your daughters will be carried on their shoulders. So the Gentile nations, God expects, they're tasked with bringing the Jews back to the land. Did you know that? Some of you did, some of you perhaps not. The Gentiles have that job to do. And there are people doing it. There are organisations like Operation Exodus, runs under the Ebenezer Emergency Fund. They've been bringing the Jews back to the land of Israel for 50, 60 years, maybe more. I'm not quite sure when they started. But they're an organisation, their headquarters is in Bournemouth, and they have people working, Gentile people, mostly, working in many, many countries of the world. They worked a lot in Russia before it was not possible anymore. They brought many Russian Jews to Israel. They're still working in the countries where they can, like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Ukraine. They work in Argentina, in Brazil, in Australia, in Japan. Didn't even know there were any Jews in Japan. But do you remember our lovely friend Beryl Murray? She went to Japan with Operation Exodus and spent some time praying there. She went to Ukraine as well, spent 3 months there with Operation Exodus. There are people all over the world helping the Jews. And now they're working a lot in Europe, in France, because the Jews of France are scared. And they only think they'll be safe in Israel. And so there's a lot of work going on in France. They're working here to help people. I don't think all the Jews will go back to Israel, but I think a lot of the younger ones will. It's a hard task for Israel as well, because they're not a big country. They're at war on 7 fronts, and they're trying to absorb all these new people coming all the time. It's hard. They've got to find space, they've got to find housing, they've got to find schools for the children, healthcare. A A lot of people who've come from some of the countries that they go to Israel need a lot of health care. They're not well. Some of them are mentally quite traumatised. They need help. So it's not easy. But it's anti-Semitism that is driving them to go back. And it's happening here. Now Jesus, I don't know, Hilary gave a lovely message about Jesus 2 weeks ago, which I listened to yesterday because I wasn't here. But one thing I don't think she said, she can correct me if I'm wrong, Jesus was a prophet. No, she didn't. Jesus was also a prophet. He didn't always know exactly what was going to happen. When the disciples asked him when he was going to come back again, he said, it's not for me to know. Only my Father knows that. So Jesus, in a sense, was prophesying like the Old Testament prophets. And in chapter 21 of Luke, he prophesied a lot about the end times. We have it in Matthew as well. But in Luke, I'm going to start at verse 21. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are inside the city, that's Jerusalem, get out of it. And let not those who are in the country come into it. For those are days of vengeance, and all things that are written may be fulfilled. Alas, for those who are pregnant and for those who have babies that are nursing in those days, for great misery and distress will be upon the land, and punishment and retribution upon the people. They will fall by the mouth and by the edge of the sword, and will be led away as captives to and among the nations, and Jerusalem will be trodden down by the Gentiles, until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. Now Jesus wouldn't give a time for that. He didn't know. So I'm certainly not going to. I don't know either. But what I do know is that it's a lot nearer now than it was when Luke wrote his Gospel. It's now more than 2,000 years on. And an awful lot of things have happened in those 2,000 years. And an awful lot of things are happening now. Yesterday in the Daily Telegraph, Charles Moore, who's a really good journalist, and I like his writing, he wrote about what Keir Starmer has said this week about recognising the state of Palestine. But he started his article by saying, Christians in this country pray the Lord's Prayer almost every day. Well, I don't know that I do every day, but we do pray it. And he said, and it says, thy kingdom come. He said, do we believe that? He said, most people probably haven't got a clue what it means. Do we really think Jesus is coming back? Now? Tomorrow? And he more or less dismissed the idea. I usually agree with him, but I didn't agree with him on this one. He more or less dismissed the idea that anybody would think that Jesus might come back today, tomorrow, next week. But I don't know. I think Christians who have an idea about what's going on in the world and who can see how things are tying up with so much of biblical prophecy can begin to believe that Jesus may come back quite soon. He may not, as I say, I'm not giving any dates. Most of the people who've given dates about Jesus coming back have finished up looking rather stupid, so I'm not going to. But there is a time when the time of the Gentiles will be complete. People began to think it was becoming complete after the Israelis took back Jerusalem from the Jordanians in 1967, because Jerusalem is no longer being trodden down by the Gentiles. But we've had quite a lot of years since then. 58, is it? Yes, 58 years since 1967. And so far that hasn't happened. But Paul talked about the ingathering, so we go back to Romans 11, about the fullness of the Gentiles being gathered in. Now, presumably he was talking about Gentiles becoming believers and becoming a part of the family of God. And we don't know when that will happen. There are still Gentiles coming to the Lord all over the world. We don't always see it, we think the church is growing smaller, but I remember somebody once saying, the church never grows smaller, because nobody who's ever joined it has been lost, and nobody who joins it now will be lost, so it's always growing. Some places slowly, some places more quickly, but the church always grows, and the gates of hell cannot prevail against it. But I do think that this country, and I said it last time I spoke, and Ruth mentioned it last week as well, we're in a dangerous position, a very perilous position. There are a lot of things going on with changing laws and bringing laws into effect that were not in manifesto, nobody voted for them, it's not democracy. And now, with this statement that we will recognise a state of Palestine. Where? Who's going to run it? I can talk to you about it afterwards if you want to. I'm not going to go into it all now. And it's a very dangerous position. It's dividing the land. And in Joel chapter 3 is a prophecy which says, I will gather all the nations, all the goyim. I will bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. This is God speaking. And there I will execute judgment on them for the treatment of my people, and he only calls the Jews my people, whom they have scattered amongst the nations, and because they have divided my land. Israel is the only land in the world that is called God's land. We may call Yorkshire God's own country. The Americans may think America is God's own land. But the only one that's mentioned in the Bible as being God's land is Israel. And if we go along this path of dividing the land of Israel, Gaza is part of Israel. The West Bank most certainly is. If you read what the land that was given to the Jewish people, the West Bank, so-called, is Judea Samaria, the heartland of Israel, the mountains of Israel. They're talking about annexing. My mouth is dry, I'm sorry. Annexing Judea Samaria. The Israelis, they had a vote in the Knesset, which was heavy majority to annex that land. Whether they will or not, I don't know. I think the nations, the Goyim, will be very much against it. But you know, Paul goes on in Romans 11, after what I just read, to say that all Israel will be saved. I'm not really quite sure whether I know what that means. All Israel. Are they all going to become believers in Jesus? I don't know. But he says this is God speaking again, he's quoting, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I shall take away their sins. From the point of view of the gospel, they, the Jews, are enemies of God, which is for your advantage. He's talking to the Romans. But from the point of view of God's choice, they are still the beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. Once he's given them, he never withdraws his gifts. Okay, I'm reading from the Amplified here. He doesn't change his mind about those to whom he gives his grace or to whom he sends his call. So that gift of the land of Israel, which was given as an eternal possession to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Moses, Joshua, King David, that land promised eternally will not be taken from them because it's God's gift and it's irrevocable. It cannot be taken from them. What will happen at the moment is unclear, but the land is theirs. But I just wanted to bring this back a little bit to more personal. The gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. That means for us too, we have a gift of salvation, the gift of the Lord Jesus Christ. That cannot be taken away from us, it's irrevocable. And we all have gifts as well. God has given us gifts and talents. Are they irrevocable too? God's calling. Have we been called? I'm just going to focus on two people. One, a Jew. Moses. Moses was saved when he was a baby, brought up in the court of Pharaoh. Then he murdered somebody and went off into exile. But there was a calling on his life that had been there right from the start. And eventually God called him again from the burning bush and said, "You've got to go and set my people free." Don't want to do that. Much too hard. I can't talk. Okay, you can take Aaron with you, he can. So Moses did what God asked him to do, went to Pharaoh, brought the people back. That calling was given to him again when he was 80 years old. Some of us are around that age. Do we still have a calling? Moses did. He had another 40 years of that calling because he didn't die until he was 120. When he got to Mount Nebo in Moab, now Jordan, saw the promised land which he wasn't allowed to enter because he'd been disobedient at one point, and then he disappeared. Nobody knew where he'd gone. He died. So that calling went on in his life. And I'm going to mention one Gentile. And this is all on his website, so I think it's permissible to talk about him. David Hathaway. David Hathaway was born in 1932. His father was an Ealing Pentecostal minister, so David was quite used to growing up with people exercising the gifts of the Spirit, which perhaps not everybody was in those days, but he was. And when he was 15, so not long after the Second World War, he was walking along the seafront somewhere on the south coast, and he heard God calling him, saying, "David, I want you, not just a bit of you, I want all of you to work for me." And he answered that call. He got trained and he started to work in the ministry. David Hathaway is now 93 and he's still working. He's still an evangelist. He still travels, as far as I know. Yes, Dorothy's nodding. He still travels. I think the last I heard of him, he was in Kazakhstan or somewhere like that. He's been on the Ukrainian front line with the soldiers there, preaching the gospel. That call that came to him when he was 15 was irrevocable, and he's still answering it. So what about us? What call do we have on our lives? Have we answered it? Are we still answering it? I can see one or two people here, I'm not going to mention names, who I know are. And I think perhaps perhaps all of us are in our own ways. We don't all have the same calling, we don't all have the same gift. If you go on in Romans to chapter 12, he talks about the gifts and how we should be exercising them in cooperation with one another. So there's no use me saying, I want Audrey's gift. She's very good at figures and auditing things and accountancy. I'm hopeless at that. I don't want somebody else's gift, I want mine. And I hope you all want yours, because you all have a gift. And I know what some of them are. And we can all go on exercising them until we're 93, like David Hathaway, or 120 if we live that long, like Moses. We may not be using gifts that we had when we were younger, the ones that we do grow out of. I was a very good badminton player when I was younger. I might have been better if I'd had a bit more training. But I can't do that now. And I don't want to do it now. So some gifts we do sort of grow out of, but the main spiritual gifts that we use as we're exercising our work for the Lord, we do not grow out of. They're still there. I chose that hymn that we sang before, Soldiers of Christ Arise, because we're in a battle, and the battle is not going to get any easier. And whatever gifts we have, we need to use in that battle. This country is not at the moment going to get an easier place for Christians to live. There are already Christians being cancelled for things that they've put on the internet, on Facebook or on whatever, and that's becoming more serious. We need to think about these things. I even thought, as I was thinking about what I was going to say this morning about some things, and I thought, I'm not sure whether I want to say that, just in case somebody listens to the recording and doesn't like what I've said. I don't know if you've thought like that, but I think life is going to be difficult. It seems like some of the police forces are better trained in looking at what people say on the internet than they are at fighting the crime on their doorstep. We need to pray for our country because we are in a battle and we need to be good soldiers. Charles Wesley, who wrote that last hymn, Soldiers of Christ Arise, he knew what it meant to battle. That was in the 18th century, late 1700s. The person who wrote the next hymn that we're going to sing also knew what it was like to battle. It was a bit later on than Wesley. We're going to sing Onward Christian Soldiers, probably one we haven't sung for a long, long time. But Rob chose that from Sue, I don't know, Sue. Because we're in a battle. So remember that, we're in a battle. I've got to know Paul rather better from doing these messages, because I've had to think about what he thought, and he was a passionate man. He was passionate for his own people, passionate for the Gentiles. He wanted everybody to know what he'd found in Jesus. Do we have that passion? I don't know. I don't think I do always, but that's what we need to fight the battles and to bring other people into the kingdom and into God's family. Because this is a family, and Sue was talking about loving our neighbours, and it should be a loving family. So I hope you've learnt something about Romans over the weeks I've been doing this. So I have. So, bless you all.